Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for joining us for the session From Assessment to Planning and Back. My name is Melissa Harden. I'm Vice President for Institutional Field Relations with the Middle States Commission on Higher Education. Joining me today is my colleague, Dr. Paul Starkey, also Vice President for Institutional Field Relations. Assisting us on the technical side of things is Ms. Victoria Clark. Thank you, Vicki. I will be leading the assessment portion of this session, and then I'll hand off to Dr. Starkey to facilitate the portion on planning and back. Please note we will pause for a 5-minute break after the section on Standard 5.
So this is a standard Middle States disclaimer. This presentation is the property of Middle States, and distribution or reproduction transmission is expressly prohibited without consent. And if you wish that consent, just write our president at MSCHE.org. If you have questions, you can always come to your Vice President Liaison. We are here to help you clarify any of this information or help you interpret it. Thank you.
We're glad to have you here today. We know that we all have many demands on our time and attention, and we appreciate you setting a time aside to be with us and to engage with us about standards 5 and 6. We have a couple of ground rules here, mainly just focusing on gathering your attention around this discussion and being sure that you're ready to engage. We will ask to use the Q&A function. Whenever you have a question you'd like to pose, the question will be private. The panelists will see the questions. We'll try to answer some of them in writing, and we'll also have a couple of periods of Q&A for your benefit.
And that Q&A function is right at the bottom of your screen. You see, you click on that, and please use the Q&A as opposed to chat, because the Q&A allows us to capture it. It also allows us to share information with all of you as opposed to it only coming to the panelists.
As with all of our training sessions, we've identified a number of learning outcomes for this webinar. After this session, participants should be able to identify Middle States expectations for assessment and use of the results of standards 5 and 6, identify strategies for documenting use of assessment practices and results, understand the role of assessment in planning and resource allocation, and discuss strategies for determining whether assessment practices are producing meaningful data for planning and resource allocation purposes.
So in this, I know that all of you are familiar with all 7 of the standards of accreditation. In this session, we're going to focus on standards 5 and 6. This doesn't mean that 5 and 6 are more important than the other 5 standards. What we found is doing research that most of our institutions do really well across all 7 standards. But if anything trips up hold on, I just got a message that my sound is not the best. So let me see if I can turn my audio up. But if anything does trip up our institutions, if they get advice, recommendations, or requirements, it tends to be standards 5 and 6. And if that's the one that kind of trips our institutions up, that's the one we want to give you as much help as possible. So that's why we're focusing on 5 and 6 here.
Okay, I'd like to remind you of the Middle States requirements of affiliation that are connected to standards 5 and 6, which we will be discussing today. The related ROAs are numbers 8 through 11, shown here in bold with a red background.
So this is just a reminder of the accreditation review cycle and how we do monitoring. So some of you are in the process of doing your self-study evaluation, and this will culminate with the on-site evaluation visit. Currently, we're doing those virtually, but we hope to at some point get back to on-site visits and have boots on the ground. That leads to, after 4 years, the midpoint peer review. You will be providing annual institutional updates, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. And then that leads into another self-study evaluation. So it's an 8-year cycle. And for some of you who've been around for a while, this is a little different. We used to have a 10-year cycle. And instead of the midpoint peer review, we had the periodic review report. But it's an 8-year cycle now, trying to tighten things up. There are some ongoing monitoring activities, and what everybody does is the annual institutional update, where we ask you to provide data about your student success, enrollment, and your financial sustainability. There are also, sometimes you may be asked to respond to recommendations or have follow-up reports, but these are the things that all of our institutions go through.
Here's one of the main reasons that we decided to offer this webinar. And the fact that we have so many attendees today gives us an indication that institutions also see the need for this kind of webinar. We can describe what we might call the evolution of the challenges that different standards present to institutions at different times. It really is a story of progress and improvement. About 10 years ago, more or less, Standard 5 was commonly cited in commission actions. Back then, many institutions hadn't yet fully embraced or perhaps implemented assessment practices for student learning. That took some time, but has since greatly improved, and the frequency of mentions has decreased. Meanwhile, Standard 4 appeared more frequently in commission actions. So when I say actions, I mean anything from recommendation to mentions, so forth. So while we've made progress on Standard 5, education effectiveness assessment, there's work to be done in some cases on assessment in non-academic units. During the same period, and more recently, references to Standard 6 have become more prevalent. But bear in mind that Standard 6 has 3 components: planning, resources, and institutional improvement, whereas Standard 5 has only 1, educational effectiveness assessment. We might speculate about the reasons for these shifts. It's not that institutions aren't doing assessment, generally speaking, but perhaps it's that the results of assessment need to be shown to inform decision-making and planning. That is, assessment results should be applied to future planning, resource allocation, and priority setting. A word of advice: all the same steps that it takes to demonstrate compliance with Standard 5, where institutions seem to feel more confident, also apply to other institutional endeavors. If your institution has room for improvement in Standard 4 and/or Standard 6, use your successes carrying out educational assessment and adapt it to these other areas, both non-academic and institution-wide. Remember also that assessment is the last criterion of every standard. So team members on Standard 6 should be paying attention to what the other standard team members are saying about assessment in their particular areas. Let's look more in depth at Standard 5. Notice that this standard calls institutions to examine all levels of their educational programming under the lens of their unique mission in the larger context of higher education. These forms of scrutiny are both introspective and outward gazing, compelling the institution to seek continuous improvement while holding itself accountable. Think about what your priority is in participating in this webinar or in your particular function at your institution. Or which of these purposes do you think are most in need of attention? Improvement, accountability, or both? Let's take a poll to see what concerns our audience. I'm going to ask Vicki to launch the poll. So we'll give you a minute. Take your pick: improvement, accountability, or perhaps both. And we'll wait a minute and see the results, just to get an idea of where people are putting their focus today. Okay, I'm going to pick one. All right. All right, Vicki, can you show us the results? Okay, so looks like an overwhelming majority interested in both areas, right? So a little bit of introspection, a little bit of accountability, and a blending of the two. Perfect. All right, let's keep going. So done thoughtfully, collectively, and consistently, assessment can help you advance your goals to help students learn more effectively, bring faculty and staff together to identify and discuss important issues, help faculty and staff see how courses link together, provide important feedback to different constituencies, provide important information about quality to institutional stakeholders, and bring neglected issues to the forefront. Finally, it can help faculty and staff to make better decisions and use limited resources more wisely, an area we'll target in the second half of the webinar. Let's take a look at the cycle of assessment as a series of steps. Oh, now I have to remember, click, click. First, we begin with identifying goals and objectives for the program. And that could be a course, activity, degree, what have you, which of course should be aligned with the institution's mission. The goals and objectives should lead to identification of specific student learning outcomes and criteria for success. Outcomes without criteria for success will make it very difficult to determine whether the goals have been achieved or not. You need to describe the markers of success. A note on criteria for success. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Every assessment plan is a work in progress. You then decide the methods you will use to gather data for assessment. Determining and implementing methods will probably require some professional development. Be sure to consider related needs, time, space, expertise, and support as you develop or expand your assessment program. Data gathering needs to be planned and conducted on a regular basis. Data without analysis makes assessment a meaningless exercise. Data gathering and analysis is a shared responsibility. Action plans are what we call closing the loop. Later in the webinar, we'll discuss some examples of how assessment results can be used for improvement in resource allocation. Alignment of resource allocation includes not only resourcing departments and units, but also resourcing assessment. Finally, assessment is the foundation for strategic planning and operationalizing those plans, which leads us back to reviewing and likely revising the goals and objectives. And the cycle begins again. How long does this cycle take? That may depend on how elaborate and how expansive the assessment program is. Whatever the nature of your current assessment plan, you can refine and grow it over time and with experience. The assessment process is not only about compliance. Assessment and self-study processes are also designed to facilitate ongoing conversations with an eye toward shoring up those areas where we might see challenges, lead to new ideas and approaches to improve our own institutions and student learning in all academic programs, make us aware of the ways that learning goals and outcomes are connected across the institution. Standard 5 includes 5 critical components. The first is that every program, regardless of type, where it is taught, and modality, must have student learning goals and objectives that clearly relate to required courses and other educational experiences. Second, these goals and objectives are regularly assessed using appropriate, periodically collected assessment data, be it qualitative or quantitative in nature, using defensible methods. Remember that collecting and presenting assessment results alone is necessary but not sufficient to comply with all the criteria of the standard and their related requirements. Gathering assessment information, summarizing the results, and presenting them on a table is a good practice, but even that's not enough. There must also be clear and compelling evidence showing that people get together for important conversations, whether it be for institutional level student learning outcomes, such as with general education, or for individual academic programs, to discuss what the results mean for published learning goals and objectives, and furthermore, that they take action with those results on a regular basis. There must also be evidence of an overall evaluation of the meaningfulness, usefulness, and efficiency of these assessment processes by relevant institutional constituents at all levels of the institution. Assessment methods used by institutions should reflect the 4 features noted on this slide. Sustainable, our first feature, means that whatever is used is of sufficient quality that it can be maintained over time without a major reworking of the assessment process each year. Sometimes we get caught up worrying that we have to create the perfect mechanism and then reinvent it every time we go to use it. That's not the case. This does not mean that an assessment process cannot change, but these changes occur naturally as institutions and their staff improve the process over time. Especially now when the Commission expects institutions to have implemented assessment processes over time, there should not be a sense that the assessment process was implemented solely for the purpose of an upcoming evaluation visit. The second feature of an effective assessment process is that it is pervasively applied across an institution, regardless of type of delivery method, whether the program is delivered in whole or in part, at a branch campus, additional location, additional instructional site, etc., and regardless of the type of program accreditor, if applicable. The third feature of an effective assessment process is that it be appropriate in the eyes of the higher education community. We talked a moment ago about accountability. Any assessments used should relate directly to the goals and objectives they claim to be used for and requirements of affiliation number 9 mandates. The time frame within which the assessment process is implemented also should seem appropriate. And the fourth feature of an effective assessment process is that it is efficient. Application of the process should not require an extraordinary effort, should be clearly associated with goals and objectives, and should be presented in appropriate form with appropriate samples selected for review. So taken together, effective assessment processes enable institutions and their stakeholders to apply a process that is reliable and includes information in aggregate form that naturally leads to conversation and action. It's organic. It adds value to institutional endeavors for continuous improvement. The reward of an assessment process done well is the recognition of challenges and opportunities that leads to analysis and action. So we've talked about the features of effective assessment processes and the results they are designed to produce. Let's look now at the expectations for an academic assessment structure. Assessment should take place at every level within the student learning experience: individual courses, programs, general education, and institutional learning outcomes. Institutional learning outcomes are included here because many colleges have overarching learning goals for all students, regardless of major. Sometimes these are addressed in the general education curriculum, but some institutions identify goals that are addressed beyond the general education program. One such example would be writing across the curriculum, which is addressed both in the academic field of study as well as in general education. Another example might be community engagement, which may or may not overlap with other academic areas. Other expectations for an appropriate assessment infrastructure are related to policies and procedures. Policies should set expectations and clarify definitions, such as the difference between direct and indirect methods of assessment. Evaluation teams usually look for this kind of infrastructure. Many institutions have assessment committees. Some even have specialist positions that are related, but their purposes and functions should go beyond training and setting expectations to include analyzing and using results. The important thing is, what are we doing with the information that we're collecting? How is it informing our actions and decisions? As you consider where your institution falls on the continuum of developing, implementing, and revising its assessment infrastructure, here are some questions for you to pose in order to gauge the effectiveness of your current practices. Clearly, where resources are abundant, these questions may more readily be addressed. But even, or perhaps even more importantly, where financial, human, or other resources are scarce, institutions can use assessment data to set priorities and allocate those precious limited resources to the areas most in need. Next, you'll want to decide how best to document and assess your assessment practices and how you will demonstrate your institution's assessment is both sustainable and pervasive, not a once and done. These are the types of documentation that usually come to mind: plans, reports, process graphics, meeting minutes, communications, different forms of information gathering or reporting that might be a normal part of institutional endeavors. But this is where you should think about the unique culture and practices of your institution to identify other, more meaningful items. On the next 4 slides, we'll look to share some examples of assessment documentation that our member institutions have used over the last 4 years. Here's an example of documentation of course level assessment. Imagine this at the unit or a departmental level. Policies and procedures, sample course syllabi, evidence of consistent assessment in multiple sections across a particular course, rubrics, these sorts of artifacts and examples. Here we have common examples that can be used to document assessment practices for programs. Note each item and its practical applicability. For example, policies drawn from program web pages, handbooks, training programs, curriculum maps over a period of time showing revisions or improvements as a result of assessment, a calendar or timeline of program retreats or workshops, or other forms of discussion about assessment results along with plans to make changes, and perhaps examples of direct assessment methods and how they were used. Here are some approaches to documentation of assessment practices for general education. A description or plan of how general assessment involves groups and individuals from across the institution, examples of assessment practices that occur over the entirety of the student experience, discussions of results among members of different departments or units for purposes of calibrating the results and adjusting the method to target the desired outcomes. These are just some examples. And finally, we have some examples for institutional learning outcomes assessment. We mentioned that just a moment ago. Community service is an example that we just mentioned. Such an outcome could be traced in both academic and non-academic student experiences. This means that the approach should include and perhaps in some cases emphasize the institution's co-curriculum and extracurricular activities. The important thing here is that an institutional learning outcome should be accompanied by evidence that it invites engagement across all areas of the institution. Let's pause for a moment to identify other examples of documentation of assessment practices. This is the one time we want to use the chat box. So why don't you take a look, give it some thought, and insert maybe a very brief example that wasn't already shared that you think is relevant or might be useful for others. We'll give you a minute or two to enter your example, and then we'll share examples with the audience. I'm going to pause. So you might be thinking about specific examples that didn't come up in those previous slides, things that you've been especially successful with, or that you've seen perhaps as an external reviewer or with your colleagues at other institutions, you found them to be especially useful or beneficial. So, okay, so we got some examples coming up. Okay, so I see here course evaluations. Good example. The question is, how do you use it, right? What are you learning from these course evaluations? Are they being used consistently across different departments? What have you learned from the experience? What improvements have you been able to make? Focus groups on assessment outcomes. Another great example, maybe a little bit more labor intensive, but will yield a different sort of result, perhaps more nuanced information from different individuals who are affected by these efforts. Assessment summit or data days at school, excellent example. Ways to set aside time, valuable time, to really focus on the work that you're doing. Advisory committee minutes around program competency discussions, another good example. Sharing data highlights via email, excellent. Ways to communicate, to share the information across the institution, to make it part of your daily conversations, ongoing discussions about what's happening on your campuses or at your institutions. Using student performance in licensure or certification examinations as an indicator, another excellent example. E-portfolios, great. These are excellent examples. Thank you so much for sharing. Very, very useful.
Melissa, if I can interject, we've had a couple of things come up in the Q&A that are related. One example, somebody said internal control assessments, and that's going to be a great way to kind of tie what we're talking about in standard 5 to standard 6, because many times we use those internal controls to do the non-academic side. And then another contribution was case studies, kind of using, sometimes folks will use program reviews to kind of go to as a case study. and use that as a periodic assessment of different programs. Sorry to interrupt.
Great. So lots of different ways to, and that's just it, right? The idea is to have a variety of forms of assessment that produce different kinds of results that can be balanced one with the other, and that can help sort of tease out the information you really need that you can find actionable. All right. I think I lost my place. All right. Here we go. So let's focus in on criterion 3 of standard 5, which states that an accredited institution possesses and demonstrates what's cited here on this slide regarding how and for what purposes assessment results are used, right? So the whole idea is what will we do with this information once we gather it and painstakingly analyze it. Criterion 3 provides a useful roadmap for use of assessment results and can be a mechanism for spurring innovative initiatives. Two of the practical applications of assessment results mentioned in Criterion 3 are assisting students in improving their learning and improving pedagogy and the curriculum. Here's an example for the latter. Item analysis is a process by which you systematically examine responses to particular parts of an assessment to evaluate their quality as a metric for outcomes. Stated simply, it's looking at your exam questions or your assignments and determining if they're achieving the desired result. This process is worthwhile at all times, but it's especially valuable as many assignments are being rewritten for the online teaching and learning environment. The evaluation of how well students performed may help you determine which questions or assignments aren't serving their purpose and should be reevaluated. Another application of assessment results is found in another criterion of standard 5 that refers to improving key indicators of student success, such as retention, graduation, transfer, and placement rates. Data collection and analysis can lead you to identify factors that appear to contribute to or detract from student success, making it possible to smooth any stumbling blocks and reinforce or replicate elements that support success. Some examples that come to mind: you may discover that transfer students who don't take certain common early courses need an opportunity to gain exposure to institutional culture and knowledge in order to integrate more fully and persist to graduation. You may learn that students abandon a major or the institution itself after encountering difficulties with certain courses or requirements. You may conclude that the course sequence of a major or program doesn't adequately prepare students for what lies ahead in the major or the program. You may find that student success or difficulty in particular areas correlates to success or difficulty later on in their educational experience. These types of observations can lead to greater awareness of the overall learning experience and may enable you to make adjustments that help to attract, engage, support, retain, and graduate more students. Yet another criterion of Standard 5 focuses on using assessment results to review and revise academic programs. Here you'll want to provide documentation of the use of results. For example, you can conduct an item analysis in national or discipline-based exams to determine how your program aligns with national norms. That's one of the examples that was cited in the chat box a little while ago. You can revise advising procedures with attention to faculty and advisor workload. You can note changes observed in student milestones and adjust curriculum maps accordingly. One likely result of assessment is the identification of a need to provide professional development activities for faculty and support staff. Of course, you should demonstrate actions taken in this regard. You might do this by providing the following: agendas for professional development activities that show rationale for the topics covered and activities pursued, an assessment showing an uneven understanding, perhaps, of assessment methods by faculty and staff, indicating the very need to do this sort of activity, or maybe assessment committee meeting minutes showing discussion of assessment results and action items developed to address weaknesses. Another example we heard from the chat was sort of the assessment day, or the gathering of individuals or groups to look at information and really setting aside time to get the benefit of that data collection and analysis. Finally, assessment results should also prompt the implementation of other processes and procedures designed to improve educational programs and services. Identifying challenges and opportunities is only half the task. The other half involves tracing how all the various processes and procedures connect with the different parts of the student learning experience and ensuring that they're working together to support student success. Examples of documentation here might include a rationale for changes in the order of approval of practicum sites, data that justify the selection of courses to receive supplemental instruction resources, documented improvements or lack thereof of disaggregated cohorts of students engaged in high impact experiences to really target these areas of need where they are. Or perhaps integrating an institutional learning outcome such as writing across the curriculum in upper level courses to increase student achievement overall. The overarching goal of Standard 5 and of educational effectiveness assessment is to build and benefit from a culture of assessment. A purposeful institution-wide program assessment can help to support faculty and staff, streamline processes to make assessment less of a burden, highlight the value of assessment, create expectations for assessment prior to curricular transformation or requests for additional resources, and make assessment an integral part of planning. In a perfect world, all institutions would have limitless resources to address all the needs that reveal themselves through effective assessment. In reality, most institutions have limited financial and human resources, so they have to make difficult decisions about how to use them to respond to matters arising. The reason that educational effectiveness assessment, viewed through the lens of an institution's mission, is so critical is because it can inform those decisions more precisely about the needs and guide the institution to use its priorities to determine an appropriate use of those resources. This graphic illustrates often conflicting areas of need: matters of workload equity, staffing levels, financial support, demonstrable benefits, and idea generation. All of these are important and worthy of attention. A good working assessment plan can help an institution strive for balance. As you prepare to document your achievement of this criterion, consider the place of non-instructional units such as advising, tutoring, registration, and financial aid. Document how new programs are created. Is there a process? Show it in a graphic. Document the process for budget requests connected to assessment. Assess the impact of new initiatives or pilot projects, and then document the reasons to continue or discontinue those. In summary, effective assessment of student learning and institutional effectiveness enhances communication overall about the institutional strategy, leads to better focus and alignment of activities with strategies, enables organizational improvement, furthers progress toward mission and vision, puts the focus on institutional priorities, and improves decisions about planning and resource allocation. Earlier, we asserted that assessment isn't a once and done activity for the purpose of an upcoming evaluation team visit. Rather, it's an invitation and an obligation to engage the entire institution in discussion about why they do what they do, how it does and doesn't lead to the desired results, and what can be done to make it better. Listed on this slide are several ways to start the conversation and to keep it going in a lively and engaging manner. Some of the examples will sound familiar from what we heard from our colleagues a moment ago. Dedicate regular meetings to focusing exclusively on data review for informed decision-making, rather than adding it to the bottom of an already long agenda. Set up monthly, quarterly, and annual analytics meetings and invite campus partners as appropriate. Share the marketing and communications analytics reports. Notice my intentional use of the word analytics. Handing someone data without analysis isn't helpful, especially to colleagues who are not familiar with your professional field. Offer to present the report so that you can create an opportunity for a conversation and to widen that conversation as you go. Speak in metrics. Ask data-driven and comparative questions. How does that result compare to 1 year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago? How does it compare to aspirational peer institutions? Offer to proofread and design campus partners' internal assessment reports. This idea is not about seeking control. Rather, it's an opportunity to improve data visualization for readers, synergize vocabulary, and find areas for aligning cross-campus goals and objectives. Meet regularly with your institutional research and effectiveness office, or your assessment committee, or faculty assessment teams, or whatever the mechanism or group or body is that you use at your institution. Seek to understand standards, evaluation criteria, policies, and procedures. Establish a mutual understanding of the role communications plays in creating a culture of continuous improvement and making it visible. One of those other examples we saw earlier was about including assessment information or data in campus-wide emails. That's an easy, simple way of sharing information. Don't wait for your institution's next reaccreditation self-study. Fostering a culture of assessment should be continuous and not left to the offices of institutional research, effectiveness, or the committee on assessment. It really is something that everyone should be involved in. By investing the time and energy into developing and maintaining a culture in which assessment is at the center of important conversations, you can make better, more strategic decisions with your available resources to advance your institution's mission. In a few moments, we're going to transition to the next portion of our program with a focus on Standard 6, Planning, Resources, and Institutional Improvement. But before we do that, we'd like to pause to review some of the questions that have been posted in the Q&A. And I'm going to ask Paul to chime in to give us kind of an overview of what kinds of questions have come up and we'll repeat the questions and then share some responses.
Sure. I've been trying to answer questions as they come in, but we have some now, Melissa, that really relate to sustainability. So one of the questions was, how do you convince your administration at your institution that assessment is not the responsibility of one person or one office? And I think that one is really key, especially at some of our smaller institutions. You want to take that one on, or would you like for me to?
I'll start and you can fill in with.
Sure, happy to.
So I spent most of my career at a very small institution where resources are limited and individuals and departments do lots of different jobs, right? So number one, there may not be the opportunity to have one person or one committee or group focus on the effort, but there's no harm in having a particular group kind of lead the charge, no? The more important way maybe to convey to the administration that this is something that everyone should engage in is that you want to see improvement at every level. So one of the slides that we had earlier talked about looking at the course level, the program level, the departmental level, the institutional level, the general education, the institutional learning goals across the institution. And so because we're all interested in being successful in all areas, we really all need to play a role in contributing to creating methods of assessment, engaging in conversations and analysis around the results, and then in collectively, in as much as is appropriate and the structures allow, contribute to conversations about what happens then when it comes time to allocate resources and set priorities. How do those decisions get made? So I'll let you, Paul, talk about. You've been at a different type of institution, and
sure. Mine was a little bit different type, and one of the things that we did was try to make sure that the people, instead of having one person do the assessment, let's have the people who are going to use the assessment data and the analysis of that data, have them be involved in the assessment itself. Because if they're the ones, if I'm just gathering data and I'm sending it to the institutional research office and I never see anything come back, that I keep wondering, is this just going into an abyss? And for what reason am I doing this? But if you involve many people across the institution and they see why we're doing it and they see the results of doing it and they can use those results in improving their program, then they may buy in and you can get broader participation. Now, do we need some folks who are perhaps a little more expert to help provide guidance on this? Absolutely, absolutely. Because if you think about it, if you go into your registrar's office and you ask them how they do assessment, they say, "Well, yeah, I don't do assessment," but they do. Yeah, it's like, okay, well, how have you made changes in your process? Oh, we analyzed this and we looked at how long it was taking to do this, and we said we can make this more efficient. They just did assessment. Sometimes we call it data-driven decision making. I call it 3D, yeah, 3D assessment, but at least data-informed decisions. Yeah? So that's part of what we're looking here. Part of what we're trying to bring across. So, Melissa, one of the other questions is, at what level do you define a program? Because you talked about program level assessment. So does that mean a major, a cluster of majors, the entire college, a college within a university, or is it university-wide?
Yeah, I think that depends on the institution, what that means, right? I think it can mean different things at different institutions. So you might have some examples to share.
Yeah, typically you want to make it narrow enough that it's going to be useful to your faculty and staff in that area to get meaningful information to affect their processes. So if I get an institutional budget, that doesn't tell me what I need in my business administration department to allocate resources. I need something that's granular enough that's going to be useful to me. So many times we look at majors or clusters of related majors, but how you define your programs really is, as Melissa said, entirely a function of what you do. In a bit, we're going to be talking about culture, and that's kind of, what is it that drives your institution? And Melissa's talked about this a little bit. I'm going to talk about it a good bit more, but it is all about your mission. And that's the nice thing about the Middle States approach to institutional assessment, is that it is through the lens of the institution's mission.
Great.
So, Melissa, I've tried to answer some of the others as we've gone along, but and some of the ones that are coming up are a little more related to what we're going to be doing in the second half. So hopefully we'll be able to answer those as we come across that. Okay? But we wanted to give you an opportunity to take a little bit of a break, stretch your legs, refresh your butter or your coffee, and we'll be back in 5 minutes. So at 2:50, we will begin again. We are right at 2:50, and I see that our ASL interpreter is ready to go. So let's get cranked back up. So let's shift our attention to planning and resource allocation. So we're at kind of the intersection of the two standards we're talking about. Standard 5, which is assessment of student learning and achievement. Standard 6, the institution's planning and resource allocation, and requirement of affiliation, number 10. Right? So there are some things in common here. So remember that, as Melissa said, the requirements of affiliation are your minimum guidelines to be eligible for participation at Middle States. The standards kind of raise the bar and expect you to do even more. So requirement of affiliation 10 says you have to do planning, that there is institutional planning that integrates goals for academic and institutional effectiveness and improvement, student achievement of educational goals, student learning, and the results of academic and institutional assessment. So that academic and institution is that intersection between ROA 10, Standard 5, Standard 6. The student assessment is what Melissa was just talking about. So let's talk a little bit about institutional planning processes, how we allocate resources to continuously assess and improve what we do. Okay? Again, Melissa had mentioned the requirements of affiliation. 8, 9, 10, and 11 are those that are most connected to what we're doing in standards 5 and in 6. They require systematic evaluation of all your programs. You have to evaluate to assure that there is rigor, that you have integrated institutional planning, and we're going to talk about that a good bit, and that you are allocating resources based on that planning. So let's talk a little bit about Standard 6, specifically the criteria 1, 2, 3, and 9. Criteria 1, institutional objectives, institution-wide and individual units that are clearly stated and reflect conclusions drawn from assessment results. So this is a little different than what you've seen in the past, because in the past, if you've been around middle states for a while, you recall we used to have 14 standards and only 2 of them, 7 and 14, dealt with assessment. Now we're asking everybody in all 7 standards to have used assessment to inform your decision making. You want clearly communicated and documented and communicated planning and improvement processes that incorporate the use of assessment results, a financial planning and budgeting process that's aligned with mission and goals, evidence-based, and clearly linked to your strategic plans, and then periodic assessment of all of this. So we're asking our non-academic units to do their own assessment. And remember, sometimes that's a little bit of a foreign language to them. So what drives assessment? Just remember that it's all mission connected. And please remember that all 7 standards, all 15 requirements of affiliation are interconnected. If you bring one out, you lose the effectiveness of the others. So think about it. We talk about how everything you do at Middle States is mission centric. So what if we didn't have standard 1? What if we did not have a clear expectation that you have a clear mission that's appropriate for your institution and is periodically and regularly reviewed to assure that it continues to be? How do you do any of the rest without standard 1? How do you do any of the rest without standard 2? Why are you an institution of higher learning if you don't have standards 3 and 5? So all of these are interconnected, and remember that one fuels the other. Okay? So how do we use self-study as a foundation for the planning? And there's a couple of different approaches. Some institutions will use a self-study to kind of do essentially a needs analysis to say, this is where we can improve upon our processes, and this is where we already have strengths that we may build upon that, and they move from there. And it kind of feeds into the strategic planning process. Another approach is to use, if you recall, in the self-study process, we ask you to identify priorities. Those priorities may come from your strategic plan. And some will use kind of an a priori approach to say these priorities are what we're going to investigate through our lines of inquiry in the 7 standards to kind of guide our strategic planning. So we're going to use the self-study process almost as a SWOT analysis. So how do we integrate assessment with planning? It's through the lens of the mission. I know you get tired of us saying that all the time, but that's what allows us to have member institutions who are these huge research ones, and also these tiny little seminaries that are very focused on a single program. The same standards, the same requirements of affiliation apply, but it's through the lens of your mission. Mission drives assessment. Assessment drives planning. So, a quick little poll. Has your organization conducted a SWOT analysis? And most of you are familiar with that. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Have you done SWOT analysis during your strategic planning? Vicki, will you open the poll for us? Let's just take another moment to respond to the poll. And then I'll ask Vicki to share the results. So Vicki, will you post the results for us? 81% have done SWOT analysis. So this is that means that 81% of you are doing some form of needs analysis. You are doing assessment. Even if you're in a non-academic unit, if you've contributed to the SWOT analysis, you are doing assessment. And so how do we tie that assessment into our planning? And remember that one of the requirements of affiliation, use the term integrated institutional planning. And this is a little bit different than what we have seen otherwise. It's not just planning for planning's sake. It's not just strategic planning, but it's integrated. So we're trying to tie things together. So let's look at 3 different areas. Integrated, we'll talk about the practices, structure, and culture in just a moment. But integrated means that it is assessment-based, that it involves all parts of the institution. It ties to the allocation of resources, right? Assessment-based, affects all parts of the organization, tries to get everybody moving in the same direction, and is tied to your resource allocation. So 3 components there: the practices, the structure, and the culture. So practices are the things we do. How do we make sure that we are involving everybody across the organization? What mechanisms do we have in place? Are plans and planning efforts linked across the organization? One of the questions that came up as Melissa was presenting was, how do we make sure that, if we're focused on learning outcomes, how do we make sure that all the other parts of the organization are contributing to that? And this is how we do this. We're linking this across. It needs to be inclusive, and people need to understand the process. So we want to involve people from all over our organization, and they need to understand how it is used. So if you go back into a dark room and you make your decisions and you just say, okay, here's the results, folks aren't going to trust the process. You want them to trust the process, so it needs to be transparent. And do you regularly seek input from the people who are going to be responsible for implementing this, the stakeholders who are part of this? So structure, and I like to use the term infrastructure. So what are the mechanisms you've put in place that align and make it relatively easy, at least sustainable and not onerous? How have you put pieces in place that allow folks to contribute to your planning and to assessment? So do you have cross-departmental representation? So if I'm going to do strategic planning, or if I'm going to do institutional assessment, I need folks from all over the campus to be involved. And is there a person that can be accountable for this, so that we can go back and say, all right, we've decided this is the direction we're going on. So you are going to be the one who's responsible for doing it. And the third component is culture. Do we live it? Do we really value self-assessment and improvement and cooperation and collaboration? Or is this just an exercise, checking the box? If you were doing assessment to check the box, if you were doing accreditation with middle states just so you can get Title IV funding, then you're doing it wrong. This is not about checking the box. It's about improving. So can you adapt to changes? Can you use this? And do your folks, rank and file, understand how they are contributing to the process and how that process impacts them? So where does planning take place in your institution? Is it at the senior level of management? Do your departments make their decisions, but they're not collaborating with others? Do you simply go from your previous plan and update it? Or do you use assessment data as your starting point? So a little poll here. He's got it open for us. Give you just another moment to think about the nuances, the differences there, and select your response. And we'll wrap this one up. Vicki, will you publish it for us? All right, so we don't see the overwhelming response that we did last time. What we're seeing is kind of a plurality. Cabinet level, in departments in isolation, starting with our previous poll or our previous plan, and at 31% across the institution using assessment. So I would suggest that our goal here is to move towards that fourth response, because remember, integrated institutional planning starts with assessment, and it's institution-wide. So a lot of times we're asked, and as you go into self-study, you know that you're going to be developing an evidence inventory. And folks say, well, how do I show that we are doing planning? It starts with your just artifacts. These are the artifacts that help show strategic planning committee minutes, your unit goals, and showing how they are aligned or based upon your strategic plan. You may have a budgeting committee where you're going to show participation from a number of different folks around the organization. If you can document that you have used your assessment to help build the next budget and build the next plan, then that is a great way. Melissa talked earlier about that loop of that decision making and how you close that loop. That's a great review or a great means. You can use indirect, the student surveys, a campus climate survey, but remember, indirect assessments, they can provide context, but we don't want to wholly rely on indirect, because we want to have some direct assessment. Okay? Now, I remember when we first started talking about assessment 30 years ago in academics, we said, okay, how do you know that your students are learning? In typical faculty response, I was one of them. I said, well, their final grade. And that doesn't work. That's an indirect, because the moment I use attendance or participation or anything of that nature in calculating that grade, I just moved away from demonstrating student learning. Okay? So you want to use some indirects, but you also want to have that direct context as well. So in integrated institutional planning, we've got to complete the cycle. So it's mission driven. Mission tells us what we measure. What we measure tell us what we plan to do, but then we have to do resource allocation. Okay? So question for you, and we'll get to this in just a moment, but I want you to ponder, I want you to be thinking about this. How do you budget at your institution? Is it kind of a standing budget and you adjust a little bit each year? Or is it a needs-based budget? Or is it a strategic plan-based budget where you say, here's our major initiatives, and even if we have a limited amount of resources, this is how we're going to allocate our resources. Because if it's your mission and your assessment says this is what you need to do, and your plan says these are your major goals and objectives, if you don't put resources towards that, you're not going to achieve your goals and objectives. Now, Melissa alluded to it earlier. We're going to talk more about what types of resources that you have, but you need to make sure that mission drives assessment, drives planning, drives resource allocation. So getting back into some of the nuts and bolts of standard 6 criteria, 4, 5, 8, and 9. You know, this is where we start talking about different types of resources that are physical and human resources, as well as physical, fiscal and human, as well as physical, technical, are adequate to support their operations. So that we have that broad array of resources that are appropriate to achieve our mission, that we have well-defined decision-making processes. Yeah? And remember, we said, do we have somebody who's accountable for achieving that? Do we have strategies to measure the efficient utilization of resources? So we don't just dump money or dump resources at something. We want to make sure that we had a question earlier about return on investment. How do we measure that so that it's not just a black hole that we're pouring money into? And the final criterion, as it is in every standard, a periodic assessment of the effectiveness of your planning, resource allocation, and your institutional renewal processes. Right? So these are the key things to that integrated institutional planning. So, two-part poll here. Are your budget officers involved in planning? So does that mean, is the budget created solely in your financial affairs office, you know, and kind of mailed out to everybody and you're told what you were going to do? Or are they involved in the strategic planning process and then they allocate the budget? And do you base your budget on, are your budgets, do they begin with base or do they begin with initiatives? So Vicki, if you will, let's launch this. So you have two questions popping up. Are your budget officers involved? Yes and no. Or are they hidden in a corner somewhere, just scribbling out on their spreadsheet? And do you begin with a base or initiatives? And we probably should have a third choice there, is base plus initiatives, but I'm not going to ask Vicki to add an option in the midst of the poll. Just another moment. And that should be enough time. Vicki, will you publish for us? Are your budget officers involved in planning? I am so happy to see that. You know, I'm hoping what that means is that it's a collaborative process, and it does not mean that your budget officers dictate the planning. You know, that may have been another question we can add next time. Do you begin with base or initiatives? And again, I think that we're seeing 75% indicated that base is the, and you know, that's the standard. That's how it seems like what we've always done. We start with base and we say, okay, we're going to have this pool of resources that we're going to put somewhere else. Okay? Thank you, Vicki. I appreciate you bringing that one up. So it's important to have critical documentation, and feedback is the key to this documentation. So you want to have links between your planning and budgeting. And remember, mission drives assessment, assessment drives planning. That's the planning drives resource allocation, and the effective use of that resource allocation should be part of your assessment. So you got to have a feedback link. One of the keys here is to make sure that you're using common language so that when you're doing that assessment, people know what you're looking for. You know? Mentioned earlier that sometimes folks in non-academic areas aren't accustomed to the terms we've used in student affairs and academic affairs about assessment. We've been doing this for 30 years. Yeah, they're not accustomed to those terms. They don't know what a learning outcome is. Yeah, but they do know what their goals are, and they do have means of measuring their effectiveness. So let's find some common language so that everybody can communicate in an efficient manner. And now let's move into the resource allocation. Systematic resource allocation. So we want to remember that this is integrated, right? So that we've involved everybody across the organization, that it's based on assessment, and that it's a transparent resource allocation, that it's tied to resources. involves everybody on campus, and it ties your resource allocation to planning and assessment. So how do we do this? Having very clear and transparent cycles and timelines for your budgeting and planning is really important. If your budget is due in December and your planning is due in February, you've got a disconnect. Yeah? So if you reverse those, you've got one means of feeding the other. Your planning, again, needs to be driven by who you are and what you want to do. And your allocations decisions are based on assessment. So where the greatest need or where the greatest gain can be achieved, that's where you want to put those resources. And then you look at this periodically, very regularly look and say, is this working for us? And please don't get into this diminishing returns where you say, I've got these sunk costs, we can't afford to back out now. You know, you can't afford to sink more cost into it. So make sure you keep that in mind. Address your key goals. Address your key goals. So these are the things, if you say it's important to you, you should be putting resources to it. And if you don't, then it's not a key goal. Right? If you say it's important for us to, I don't know, grow our endowment, but you are not investing in your development staff, then it's not important to you. It's that simple. What you mind is what matters. So opportunities for improvement and innovation. Yeah, this is one of the things that I think you're going to be seeing over the next few years. The commission is going to emphasize even more, is that how can we innovate? How can we've learned from this pandemic pivot, you know, that we can do things differently. So how are we going to continue that? Use your assessment and planning as a means of identifying areas where you need to get better or where you can grow your strengths. Develop strategies to address those deficiencies and determine what resources are needed to address those deficiencies or to grow your strengths, and then allocate those resources and make sure that you are championing innovation. Cheer those who are willing to take a risk, even if they are not always successful. Some organizations have built structures for this. They have almost like an internal venture capital fund to sponsor projects and new ideas. And that's one way of doing it. You know? That creates a structure to kind of hedge your bets and to take a chance. So what happens when the unexpected happens? You know? And I'm hoping that very, very soon we can get a new image that is not COVID related to put on this slide. It begins with mission. Stick to who you are. You know, your core identity is what's crucial. Yeah? If you start chasing the moment by moment emergencies, you lose who you are. You know? So it begins with mission. That's the core. And that means that you need to stay on goals. You know? Without your goals, you're adrift. So remember who you are, focus, and remember that it is still our goal to achieve these goals, even in the face of all types of crises. Yeah? So I was amazed at how our member institutions pivoted during the pandemic, and institutions who had never done distance learning poured resources into equipping their faculty and staff for that, training their students, providing equipment to students, and they did it. Was it as good as what we were doing? Probably not. But are we getting better at it every semester or every trimester? Yeah, we are. You know, and we're showing that there can be a new mode, but we're still putting it in the terms of the mission of the organization. So we want to do emergency planning and contingency planning. You know, we don't want to be so locked in to a single goal that we can't be flexible and resilient. You know, and we want to have a contingency plan in place. So what if? So we want to build for that unforeseen moment. So can you build that flexibility into what you're doing and that ability to change when something that you never expected to occur? So I mentioned that we want to do contingency planning. You know, how do we predict the unpredictable? Well, we do what if analysis. You know, we say, I may not be able to predict the pandemic, but if my institution is located near, say, a chemical plant that has a gas leak, you know, I'm going to have to pivot. How do I continue operations even if I can't be on campus with my students and my faculty? How do we continue to function? The folks along the Gulf Coast in New Orleans knew that there were hurricanes that were going to come, you know, but did they ever expect one as big as Katrina? Yeah, and that they had to build that flexibility and pivot. And if you want a lesson in good emergency management, look at the Tulane University and how they adapted to that hurricane and how they have become even stronger since that time. Build flexibility, build resiliency. Resiliency is that grit, that ability to come back. Do the what if analysis. What are the things that are most likely to occur? You know? And what are the things that, even if they're not hugely likely, could do the most damage to my institution? Keep in mind, who is it that you are? You know, are you a community college in rural Pennsylvania, or are you this research one in a metropolitan area? What are you there to do? And how would you build structure to assure that you can continue to do that? So even in emergencies, we need to do assessment. Now, it's not a great analogy, but think about if all of us have seen these medical shows. We see them wheel a patient into an emergency room, and the healthcare professionals start their work, but they're constantly checking different signs, right? You know, they're doing assessment. Is this procedure working? Is it functioning for us? They're constantly seeing. They're not just using one technique. They pivot and they try other things if one thing is not working. So even if it's on the fly, your assessment should guide your decision making, and you put your resources where they can do the most good. Again, using the healthcare analogy, it's kind of like triage. If you had a huge event, and you can save some lives if you put resources to it, and there are others that could not be saved at all, you know, how do you decide where to put your limited resources, where you can do the greatest good? So, well, let's open this up with some of the learning outcomes, and I'll close with them. We hope that in today's session, you've been able to identify our expectations for use of assessment results in both standards 5 and 6. And if we haven't achieved that, I apologize. Please contact your VP liaison and say, you know, that Paul Starkey's an idiot. Can you help me understand what he was meaning to say? Melissa hopefully gave you some useful strategies for documenting how to the use of your assessment results. Remember, closing the loop. It's not enough just to do assessments and put the report on the shelf. We now have to analyze it, use it to affect our decision making. We hope that you understand how assessment guides planning and resource allocation, that maybe cleared something for you, and some of the strategies for determining whether your assessment practices are producing meaningful data and useful things in making some of your decisions. So we are going to go to the Q&A, and I'll remind you that, and I know that many of you have been putting questions into the Q&A function. It's right down at the bottom of your screen. And we will be happy to answer questions that you may have.
Paul, I'm going to draw your attention to a comment about, it says here, one of your slides showed the expectations for assessment from course, program, and institutional level. I've been told that Middle States doesn't require course level assessment since the standards state that all programs should be assessed. So it's kind of the question about how much is enough, what is required, that sort of thing. Could you maybe address that?
Sure, it's practically impossible to do program level assessment without some course level assessment. Now, does that mean that you need to assess every course in every program, every semester, every section that it's offered? No, it doesn't. But what many of our institutions have done is said, okay, here's where we are going to introduce something. This is where we're going to develop something. And this is where we hope that our students have mastered that something, you know? And so at different points through the program, and what that gives you is program level assessment, but you're assessing that course first to see if it is if it's functional, you know, if it is contributing to that overall program outcome. You know, there's a reason we have course level student learning outcomes. You know, so it's they should be assessed. Is it a must that you show everyone every semester, every section? No, no. Remember, you also want your assessment system to be sustainable, you know, and you want it to not be onerous. You know, you want it to be something that is useful. It provides timely feedback, and that you can use that to make your decisions to move and to allocate the resources. Okay. So hopefully we answered that one for you. It's like I said, are you required to document every course? No, but it's incredibly difficult to do program level assessment if you don't have the key courses at least, that contribute to that program level.
Another question you might want to answer, Paul, is can you provide another example of integrated institutional planning approach with use of assessment from student learning and student support side?
Yeah. So let's consider this. We have a goal to, at our institution, at our university or college, to grow our healthcare majors. You know? We know that these are intensive, they're resource intensive, they need a whole lot of student support. They tend to be very competitive for admission. Yeah. So in order to do that, let's say that we're going to launch a new physician's assistant program. And so what do we need to do this? So we need to think about what are the facilities we need? What are the laboratories we need? I happen to know, because I used to have one, you've got to have a cadaver lab. Yep, that is the one laboratory on my former campus that I never went in. It's where the cadavers were kept. But I mean, what expertise do you need on faculty? What expertise do you need for clinical placements? How are we going to recruit these students? How are we going to gain our program accreditation? What facilities do we need? What human resources do we need? What information do we need? That's where we're integrating things, you know? So I'm going to have my facilities management folks involved. I'm going to have my enrollment management folks involved. I'm going to have my academic support folks involved, because, you know, these are highly competitive students. So this is where I'm going to put a team together from. I'm going to have my library involved, because the PAs need a whole different set of resources than some of my other majors. So it's important that we connect, you know, all across campus. So we could do the same thing if we were talking about building a dormitory. You know, well, who's going to be in it? Are we going to have learning communities in it, or is it going to be only first-year students, or is it going to be kind of is it going to be co-ed? How are we going to do programming for student engagement there? You know, how are we, all kinds of good things. You know, as well as the just building it and maintaining the facility. So hopefully I gave you a couple of examples where you could do that. Right? You could do the same thing when you're launching, let's say you're pivoting to online learning, you know, distance learning. You are supposed to provide the same support to students, the same support to distance students that you do to your face-to-face students, which means that they have access to the resources, that you might have in your college store, that they have access to counseling, that they have access to advising, disability services, the whole gamut. You know? So there's just one more example of how you need that integrated approach, that team approach. We can't operate in silos. Okay.
We have time for a couple questions more. How about, is this more holistic approach to assessment and decision-making and so forth? Should various centers in the university also be included in the assessment process? So there are different questions have come up about what needs to be assessed and to what level of detail.
Sure. The short answer is yes, everybody should be involved in assessment. I mean, that's what Standard 6 is about. Yeah, so I could be this huge research-based institution and have this research park that's adjacent to the main campus. Why? And why do you have that research park? Because it contributes to the mission of your research-focused institution. Yeah, so there needs to be some collaboration. So do the folks at the research park need to do the very same assessments? No, but there should be some complementary assessments that help inform what you're doing in, for lack of a better term, the core educational component of your university. Right? So do I need to do assessment of my budget area? Yeah, you do. So that you can tie how you budget to your major goals of the institution. Do I need to do assessment and facilities management? Absolutely. Absolutely. And it should be complementary to what we're doing across the campus. Right? So do we have to do everything exactly the same way? No. If I've got a workforce development unit at a community college, they have different goals, but those goals should be complementary to the strategic goals of the institution. Otherwise, why are you doing it? And if you don't have a good reason for why you're doing it, then should it really be a part of your institution?
Great.
Are we about out of time, Melissa?
That's right.
Yeah. Well,
That's right.
I want to thank my colleagues, Melissa Harden and Vicki Clark, for doing this. And I want to show you. Let's see if I can get to it. I've got one last slide. Some resources for you. Of course, you're always welcome to contact me or Melissa. And here are our email addresses. You, by the way, will receive a copy of the recording of this, along with a copy of the slide deck. Okay, I've had a couple of questions about that. So our webpage has a ton of resources. So please feel free to go there. And if you need some help navigate that, contact your VP liaison. And if you don't know who we are, ask your accreditation liaison officer who's our contact at Middle States. They know who we are. They'll be in touch with us. We encourage you to take part in our town halls and in our annual conference. We are so happy that we're going to be back in a face-to-face annual conference this December in Philadelphia. And our colleague Vicki, who's been handling things today, she turns into Conference Vicki there because she marshals that process and is fabulous at it. And we hope that you will consider being a part of that conference. A call for proposals will go out or may already be out. If you've got some innovative ideas that is working at your campus or a consortium of campuses, share it with us. Yeah, this is a great place to pick up new ideas, to connect with others, and we hope that you'll be a part of that. Melissa, anything additional?
I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. We've had a large attendee list and we've gotten through almost all the questions. Feel free to reach out to your vice president representative from Middle States, and we're happy to engage with you in a conversation that's much more tailored to your specific needs. So thank you all for joining us. It's been our pleasure.
So folks, thank you so much. We appreciate your attendance and we hope that you will join us for future events. Take care. Bye-bye.